I'm Charlotte Wright. I'm CMA Bay Area's chapter president. I'm thrilled to have you all here today. I'm so excited to hear from Dr. Jennie Ito and Sarah Sweney about what's being done to help keep kids safer online, a topic I know we all can agree is so critically important. Whether you're not so sure about what trust and safety is, or you yourself work in the industry, I know there will be so much for all of us to learn today. If you have questions throughout our discussion, please share them in the chat and we will do our best to get to them before we close. So before I introduce Jennie and Sarah, I'd like to share a bit about the Children's Media Association. CMA is a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization that brings the children's media community together for great presentations like this one and virtual and in-person events as well. CMA's mission is to support professionals that work in a variety of different verticals in the children's industries. And we also offer many benefits to our members, including an amazing job board, networking events, these in-person and online events and discussions, a fantastic mentoring program, workshops, and much more. We currently have chapters in the Bay Area, Los Angeles, and New York City, with other chapters to be announced soon. Very exciting. And our presence is international, with members both in the US and all around the globe. What's unique about our Bay Area chapter is that we focus on tech, software, apps, technology, toys, and research, all in the kids industry. And if you enjoy today's presentation and you're not a member, we'd encourage you to sign up to be a member. And if you're located in the Bay Area, we encourage you to consider joining our Bay Area chapter. And even if you don't live in the area, but your work focuses on tech for kids or you're interested in that type of work, please also consider joining the Bay Area chapter. We would love to welcome you into our community. And if you're already a member, thank you for joining us and being here today. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennie Ito and Sarah Sweney. So Dr. Jennie Ito is a developmental psychologist who specializes in children's play, content appropriateness, and children's media. She is currently a senior product policy manager, developing age-appropriate content policies to keep users safe on Roblox. Before that, she led content policy development for kids' experiences on YouTube and YouTube Kids, was a UXR on the kids and family team at Google, and a Google Play Families and Kids policy specialist. And prior to joining Google, Dr. Ito had her own play consultancy where she reviewed toys, evaluated media for content appropriateness, and helped toy and media companies create meaningful play experiences for young kids. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Jennie.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Sarah Sweney, welcome. She is a trust and safety strategist and operations manager with over 15 years of experience in child development, research and policy development, and most recently, generative AI product development and risk. She is currently a policy operations manager at Google for the kids and family policy team. Before that, she led policy enforcement for kids' experiences at YouTube and parent research for YouTube Kids as a UX researcher. And before coming to Google, Sarah was a kids media research consultant where she developed products and conducted research for companies like Toca Boca, Leapfrog, Nickelodeon, and Sesame Workshop. We're so excited to learn from you today, Sarah. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we clearly have a lot to learn from Jennie and Sarah. Let's jump right in. Let's get started. First, I know trust and safety might be new for some of our audience members. They might be unfamiliar with all that entails. So Sarah, for those who may not be familiar, can you define what trust and safety is and how it differs from other policy or research roles?
Sure, absolutely. So trust and safety is a relatively new industry, both for kids and families work, but also across the tech space as well. It's really only becoming formalized over the last couple of years. But you really can think of it in kind of a two-factored approach. One is the rules of engagement. So writing the rules of how people engage and experience the internet across platforms. So that could be at a place like Google that, is really looking at the entire internet, or YouTube, which looks at video, Roblox, social media platforms, kind of like you name it. And then the second part of that is enforcing those rules that are written, and that kind of encompasses both Jennie and my expertise and work. It's really a way to bridge like the theoretical thought process and approach for product policy with the actual practical application of it as well. So it does weave a lot of research, academic research, UX research, and public policy into those roles. But the main distinguishing factor is centered on making sure that the policy work is utilized and enforceable, so it can actually bring actual safety solutions and initiatives to users, and in our capacity to kids specifically.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And before we dive into more details around your work in trust and safety, we would love to learn a little bit more about your path. So I'm sure it's clear to the audience after hearing me read your bios that you both have such rich and diverse experiences and interesting paths to your current roles. So starting with Jennie, can you each share a bit more about your background and your path to your current role?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sarah and I both share a similar background in terms of child development, but also a similar path to how we got our tech roles. So I graduated with my Ph.D. in developmental psychology. I actually moved down to Maryland. I'm Canadian, so I did my graduate work at Queen's University. I moved down to Maryland to do a postdoc, but while I was finishing up my PhD, I was just really struggling with whether I wanted to stay in academia. But to be honest, I wasn't really sure what else was out there for me because, as Sarah mentioned, trust and safety is fairly new. So this job didn't even exist when I graduated. And so I actually started exploring some other options. I decided to do a fellowship at the Smithsonian because I thought museums might be kind of a nice intersect between academia and industry. And I actually really enjoyed working there. I wasn't directly child development related, but I was able to use my research skills. And I think that really taught me that I could explore jobs outside of academia, and there was a lot of skills that were really relevant to other jobs and that I could bring. So I did that for a few years, and then I actually had my son, and I decided to take some time off and be at home. And during that time, we actually relocated for my husband's job to California. I was really excited about this because one of the jobs that I always wanted when I was in grad school was to work at Leapfrog, because it was one of the few kind of tech companies that was doing really exciting work. I actually met someone at a conference who ended up working there. Most of you probably know her, Jody LeVos. And so we reconnected when I moved to California. But as you can imagine, the team was pretty small, and so there wasn't a lot of job opportunities. So eventually, a couple of years in, Jody reached out to me. There was a role, and she wanted to know if I was interested in applying. Unfortunately, I literally had my daughter 3 days before, so there was no way I could. And I live in Mountain View, and Oakland is pretty far away, so it wasn't something I could do with 2 young kids at the time. So I told her no, but to please keep me in mind. And 6 months later, she reached out to me. She had a content reviewing job that was just a few hours a week. And so I thought this would be a great way to kind of try something new, make some connections. So I started doing that while I was home with my kids. And that kind of kicked off my consulting career. So from there, I started my own consultancy, and I did a whole bunch of different consulting work. I continued to work with Leapfrog. I answered parents' questions. I wrote white papers. I consulted on kids' preschool shows. I reviewed toys and baby products. So I did a whole bunch of different things. And that actually led me to the consulting role I got with Google. My husband was working at Google at the time and had heard, this was back in 2015, that they were launching YouTube Kids. And so I was really excited to hear that because suddenly these tech companies were interested in kids. And so I actually was really trying to get a research role there. But this opportunity on Google Play popped up. And so I ended up taking that consulting role. It was supposed to just be for 6 months. It ended up extending into a year. And then I was able to become a full-time employee at that point. So it was really that consulting job at Google that kind of got me in the door. And it's also the job that really introduced me to policy, because I always thought that I would want to be a researcher because that just seemed to be the natural fit given my background. But the job was on Google Play, and they had just launched the family section of the store, and they wanted someone with a child development background to come in and evaluate the program. And I just absolutely fell in love with policy. And that's how I ended up at Google, and it kind of just grew from there. So that was my journey, and I'll let Sarah share hers, which, like I said, is fairly similar.
Yes, as Jennie mentioned, very similar. I do not have a PhD. I got my master's from Columbia Teachers College, and like Jennie, was very interested in how media was being applied through, or how child development was being applied through media. I had an internship actually before I went to grad school with Sesame Workshop. And that was before the iPad had even come out. So I know I'm dating myself a little bit, but that was really when my eyes were opened to, like Jennie, I kind of thought I'd be a researcher. I really loved the academic side of things, but I think I was kind of looking for something more. And from then, after grad school, I really just sought out different opportunities. At that time, I think the industry, children's media industry, was relatively small. There were only a handful of people working in the industry as researchers, or even in product development. And everyone we all knew each other, which was kind of nice, but also really hard to get your foot in the door. And over the years, until I found my way to YouTube, I consulted, I worked in nonprofits, I worked for profits, I worked in marketing, worked in market research, outreach, and then I also found my way to YouTube. I started as a UX researcher for the YouTube Kids team. I oversaw parent research, traveled internationally to do some research. It was really, really interesting. And I had an opportunity to kind of step into the trust and safety space, not in the policy world, which is actually where I thought my skill sets lied, but in the operational side of things. So working in enforcement. And I found that I actually loved the operational side of things. The role is a lot more behind the scenes. So really kind of making things happen, executing on policies. That's where I met Jennie at YouTube, but we became extremely close colleagues while we were both working at YouTube. She was the policy to my enforcement. And so we continually worked together because we share a similar background. Even though I was in operations, it really helped kind of cement both my interest in executing on the great policies Jennie was writing, but also making sure that there was continual child developmental expertise in all of the work that Trust and Safety was doing. I was at YouTube for about 4 years, 2 years in Trust and Safety, 2 years in UX. And then about almost 3 years ago, I moved over to the Google side of the house, where I kind of taken what I knew and what I learned and what I did at YouTube onto Google as well. So I still work in the kids and family space. I'm the policy operations manager now, where I support our policy team to execute on a variety of policy initiatives. The most, I think, pressing one right now being Google's generative AI approaches for teens and kids.
Thank you both so much for sharing. Oh, I love hearing about your backgrounds and your paths, and I'm sure it's helpful for those listening, particularly those who are thinking about transitioning their career. They might have a child development background, and they're wondering, what does a role in trust and safety specifically look like for me, or what could it look like? So I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into the day-to-day work that goes into what both of you do. So starting with Jennie, what does a typical day look like for you as a senior product policy manager at Roblox?
Yes, I'm sorry. I realized I got so far into my journey that I didn't say what I actually do in my current role right now. As you mentioned, I'm on the product policy team at Roblox, and I focus on youth safety and well-being. I also should mention, while I was at Google, I was in policy, but then I actually ended up going into user research, just like Sarah, for a little bit, and then back into policy. So we do share that similar background as well. But in terms of a typical day, there really isn't a typical day, which is actually part of the reason I really like my role, because just keeps it really exciting, especially when I was at YouTube working with Sarah. Every day I come in and kids are doing crazy stuff and making videos about it, whether it was ASMR or, I mean, just like eating Tide Pods, whatever it was. They're always doing something. And so it just was like, kept the role interesting and challenging, and I really liked that. Definitely my work and my role is very collaborative. So I work really closely, obviously with our product team, but also I work really closely with user research, just given that that is part of my background, and I really value put like the user voice and putting users first. So I work really closely with them. We have a civility team that I work really closely with as well. So I love collaborating, and I love how cross-functional my role is. So that also keeps my role really interesting to me. But a lot of it is spent, when I'm writing policy, doing a lot of research. So again, kind of leveraging all those research skills that I've gathered in graduate school and throughout my career. And then, of course, writing the policies, and then working with the operations and mod team that Sarah was mentioning to help roll out and launch those policies to our moderation team. So definitely lots of meetings. I think Sarah and I are probably in meetings most days, but definitely a fun and challenging job.
Great. Thanks for sharing. How about you, Sarah? What's a typical, I know it probably is the same. There's probably no typical day, but we'd love to hear more about your work.
Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely not every day is different. And which again, I really, really liked about the trust and safety work. One of the major reasons that I kind of transitioned over to it, because I don't spend a ton of time actually writing policy. The core bulk of my work really is taking our policies and very like unforgivingly redlining them, to be honest, like this, and looking at how enforceable our policies are. I think that's one of the biggest distinctions between, I think, what we do and like what researchers are doing. Researchers are really, and we work very closely with both our UX research team, but then also academic researchers to make sure that our policies and our approaches are really grounded in developmental theory. But those policies are only as good as they can be enforced accurately and at scale, especially with the size of like the content and the users that Jennie and I are like, working with or interfacing or protecting on a daily basis. So my role really is focused on how do we take this policy and implement it into these products, incredibly cross-functional. So that, definitely involves work with our tactical enforcement team, helping them understand how to write effective enforcement guidelines, and working with our product teams, our legal teams, also to kind of help them understand, again, that user voice, and ensuring that, all of our policy principles are adhered to through all of the like tactical operations that are being built.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. So I'm hearing you talk about policy development and policy enforcement. So Sarah, I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more about how they differ and how they work together.
Yeah, absolutely. So this happens there's trust and safety is kind of broken up into like core policy areas. So things you may have seen, not specific kids and family related, hate speech, harassment, violence and extremism, sexually explicit content, and even so far as like, spam. These are all core policy areas that a lot of platforms have. Not to mention child safety, which I think a lot of times gets conflated with the work that Jennie and I both do. Child safety really is, there's a huge distinction between like the age appropriate policies that Jennie and I like have worked with and child safety. Really thinking about like child safety is really like protecting kids, who are perpetrated against like in kind of this tech world. It's like a very real reality that we face. our work is actually focused more on like kids as users. Like kids are using tech. They have been for a very long time. And they will, I think everyone here, everyone who's listening in knows that kids are not going anywhere when it comes to the use of tech. And so in terms of like, our policies and enforcement, our policies are all grounded in like developmental theory, which is again, another reason why, yes, we are, want to have in-house expertise, people that have studied child development, but there are a lot of researchers too that are still doing this really important work. So consulting with them and like building those policies is really, really important. The biggest challenge comes from the fact that we have teams of content moderators that often do not have a background in child development. And so we have to do the really hard work of turning our policies into actionable, what we call enforcement guidelines. And the content moderators that a lot of platforms work with are trained specifically to be incredibly literal when they look at an enforcement guideline to enforce. And because they do not have the background to kind of understand the nuance that permeates through our space, it's really, really important that we include both developmental theory, children's voice, but also very detailed instructions, essentially, to make sure they're enforcing accurately. This doesn't, along with that, our teams are also routinely making sure that our content moderators are enforcing our policies accurately. We routinely monitor what we call agent quality. We cover calibrations with both our agent teams and our enforcement teams to make sure we're kind of continually all aligned so that we can continue to have this kind of flywheel of, we built this policy, is it working as intended? If not, we need to kind of revisit it. I would say our policy, the trust and safety work between policy and enforcement is kind of never done because you can launch a policy, but it's not, unfortunately, I'm sure as much as Jennie would love to be like, great, it's done. Okay, I can move on to the next thing. We always have to revisit things for a variety of reasons. Escalations come up and we have to kind of revisit our policy line, or we have a very vocal, creator that doesn't like our policy line that we've drawn. And so the interface between both policy and enforcement really has to work together. It's pretty unique to have someone on the enforcement side that does have a background in child development. And I think that, when Jennie and I worked together, it was a huge part of the reason that we, kind of enforced the policies that we did. But a really strong partnership really needs to exist. And even if as an enforcement, lead or person, you do not have a strong background, like leaning on each other's, strengths, I'm sure Jennie is, leaning on, even if her enforcement team doesn't have that strong background, like our enforcement teams are very, very good at understanding the content. They work with tons and tons of data on a regular basis and analyzing that data to kind of give to Jennie or give to our policy teams to be like, hey, here's a trend we're seeing. Here's an issue agents are having trouble with. And so that kind of continuous collaboration, like enhances the flywheel, so to speak.
Yeah, I would just add that I think it was really special, like Sarah said, to have two of us, like me on the policy development side and her on the operations side working together. Because I would actually bring in Sarah like right at the beginning when I was doing the research for the policies, talking to the experts, because it can sometimes be a little lonely in tech as a child development person because you're usually on your own. So it was nice to have someone to collaborate with, to bounce ideas off of. And also it made it so much easier because there's usually like a handoff period where I'm handing the policy off to her. And as she mentioned, she's translating those into enforcement guidelines for a moderator. And just to know that like she was with me from the very beginning, she understands the spirit of the policy, she understands the research behind it, the principles, and that I can totally trust her to just, go work with the moderators and roll that out. And that can definitely be more difficult if you're working with someone who doesn't have that child development expertise.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. So it sounds like very challenging work, of course, and Google and Roblox are huge companies, right? So I'm curious to hear more about the biggest challenges you both face when translating child development principles into these scalable and enforceable, as Sarah was just talking about, enforceable policies for these huge global platforms. How about we start with you, Jennie?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's quite a few challenges for sure. I think one of the first ones that kind of pop into my head is when you work in the child space, everyone thinks they're an expert on kids. So you definitely got a lot of that. Anyone who's a parent, who knows a kid, who was a kid, has an opinion. I think this is especially the case in Silicon Valley, where you have to remind people that maybe their children aren't representative of children globally or even in the United States. So that can definitely be challenging. As Sarah said, another big challenge is just, a lot of these policies for kids are very nuanced. And so having that translate into enforcement guidelines that these moderators who don't have this background can enforce at scale and consistently is really difficult. I think that those are the first two that come to mind for me for sure. Sarah, I don't know if you have any other ones that you want to share.
Yeah, I think touching on what Jennie said first, I think, yeah, absolutely the number one challenge that I think anyone working in tech, not just trust and safety, kind of faces, especially as I think the audience for a lot of these platforms has really aged up. I think a lot of times we think about tech platforms as like, oh, the Sesame workshops, the PBSs of the world, and really focused on like the very youngest kids. We've entered over the last several years into this world that we're really focusing on preteens and teenagers. And like Jennie said, I think sometimes like to say we work with, our stakeholders or product teams that are like, their case study of 5, which is like their 5 kids. Like Jennie said, I think both Google and Roblox are such big companies that our responsibility to our users is not just, the tech savvy kids who live in Silicon Valley or New York City. It's global users. It's users in, India who, don't have, the sophisticated smartphones that we do. It's users that, don't have access to a lot of, tech access is like, it can be still a barrier to a lot of communities, both in the US, but then also globally. And so I think that's also where our research background comes in. Because like an academic research, we're really focusing on providing experiences for the whole child, the whole experience, no matter what type of access they have to. So that's challenging. And I think along with that is a lot of work in trust and safety, even at companies like Google and Roblox, we, are in the policy or the enforcement, role. That's traditionally what we do, but we also play a little bit of a program management or a product management role, kind of corralling all of these people to kind of both understand the principled approach that we really need to take in order to hold safety to a highest bar, but also kind of setting that balance between, we're very large businesses, and at the end of the day, it's like the business that matters. That was a very interesting, hard lesson to me that I learned when I kind of first came into tech. It's like, this idea of like best practices, we want to do the absolute best things for kids, and we absolutely do, of course. But if that's going to get in the way of protecting billions of kids, as opposed to, a couple hundred that really need this one very nuanced aspect, I think that's again where this kind of, the operation of safety kind of comes into play. And again, I think there's constant hand holding and just explaining. I feel like sometimes we're like teachers trying to like explain to our stakeholders, like, no, like kids aren't little adults, and no, it's not just, like they won't just be fine if they are exposed to like some violent content. There are real world harms that young kids, and it varies by age, which is why through Jennie and my work, we take like an age-based approach to safety instead of just kind of bucketing these kids into like, little kids and older kids, and, or under 18 kids as an entire monolith, because developmentally the risks are very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. Both Sarah and I came from within our consulting roles, companies that were like completely focused on children's products or offerings, and then to come into a big company where yes, it's part of it, but it's not the whole. Like it's not the whole mission and vision of the company. I think that can be a little challenging too. Just in terms of like not only getting people on board, but you have to balance like the business needs that Sarah was mentioning, but also on both the platforms that I've worked on, well, Google, YouTube, and Roblox, we also have our creators and developers that you have to think about as well. So any policy changes you make also affects them. It affects their livelihood because a lot of these people, that's how they're earning a living. And so you have to think about that. And another thing I just want to touch upon when you're talking, Sarah, about like our moderators who are global. It's not just our users that are global, our moderators are global. And not only do they not have a child development background, but they're different in different countries, different cultures. And so we also have to think about, we want them to be applying these consistently, even though they're global and they might have different like values and cultural values. So that's something to think about as well.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I know you both were speaking a bit to this tension between business priorities and child safety concerns. I'm wondering how you navigate that. If you could share a little bit more about how you navigate that tension.
Yeah. I think for me, that like Sarah mentioned, it was a tough lesson for me to learn when I first started. And, I look back and I think the feedback I got was actually 100% correct, coming from an academic world where, I'm passionate about kids and child safety. I had to come in and learn the business. I'd never worked in tech before. I never had to think about developers and creators. I just was like, this is what's best for kids. So let's just do it. Why is not everyone agreeing with me? And so I think that was definitely like a really tough lesson. And I definitely over the years have learned to pick my battles. I can't, fight for absolutely everything, but there's certain things where I'm really like, I feel very passionate about. And I feel like it's in the best interest of kids. And so I definitely always fight for those. And I think I've also learned over time that sometimes we can have small wins, but because of the size scalability of our platforms, it can actually really have a huge effect on kids, even if it's just a really small change. And so that's something that, I really think about when maybe I'm disappointed that I didn't get to launch the policy exactly how I wanted to, or maybe sometimes we start small and then we expand the policy, like just thinking about the fact that given the scale, it does still have a really, really big impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll echo that too. I think that the balance is, it's challenging because even within our work, we are also balancing like this, safety. We want to keep kids safe. And the question we ask ourselves is like, but at what cost? Because we also want kids to have a great experience within these tech companies. So we always try to also balance like the safety of our platform with how we're appealing to kids. And like, there is that spectrum of like, when kids are younger, we want it to be a much more walled garden, like safe experience, because there's very limited, they have a very like small worldview of like things that they're super interested in. They're not really going outside of their, familial structure or their school structure. And we as tech platforms can really do that. It's one of the reasons that a lot of the tech like products really focused on like young kids. And as kids age, like especially when they enter into like the preteen and especially teen, we want to keep them safe, but we also want them to find what they're looking for. And some of the things that especially teenagers are looking for are not developmentally safe for them. So there's that kind of balance in that question of like, we want to give them what they're seeking out. Teens are incredibly like risk seekers. They're going to seek out things that, they probably don't know yet. It's super risky. And then there are, of course, areas where we know teens are incredibly vulnerable, that they're kind of nervous to find, and so we kind of build that into our platforms too. And again, that comes back to like this education that we have to do with our. This constantly. I know I'm doing this at Google. I'm sure Jenny's doing this at Roblox. I think there is a big push to look more on, okay, what is the legally required? What are the legal requirements? Like, what is the platforms will ask, what is the bare minimum? And that's where we have to kind of educate them of like, well, this is the bare minimum, but then here are the safety risks you're opening yourself up to. And so that's, I think, to echo Jenny's point about like small wins, I think there are certain things where we're like, here, if we get an escalation about related to suicide, self-harm, like that's super bad for the platform, right? And so we want to mitigate any of those risks. There's other content areas where, extremely violent video games, like that's also something like from a developmental standpoint that we really want to be able to mitigate and we want to be able to limit, but sometimes we do really have to choose like what is the lesser of these two like big safety risks. And like Jenny said, it's a huge win if we could block 99% of potential suicide related content, major win. And I think kind of tackling more other policy areas later. I think that's also kind of what we will continually do. We have to like have a prioritization or a hierarchy of it. But the biggest challenge, I think, really is making sure that our teams are embedded within these product teams that are making the decisions, making the calls that, oh, we're going to launch with this product, even if it's not safe enough. And we've really had to fight to be able to do that. And now, I mean, my team really is embedded in a lot of the products that are launching if I take generative AI, because of that potential risk. And that constant education. But there is still a constant kind of push and pull. Products and companies are really focused on giving users what they want or giving users what they think they want, which is, again, why like user research, both for kids and teens, but also for like the general population is so important. And both Roblox and Google are data-driven companies. And so those are heavily embedded into our systems too.
Yeah, and I think to add about like making sure the content's appealing, because obviously from a business side, you want people on your platform, but also one big lesson I learned too, especially when we were doing our work around tweens and teens, is you also have to think about if there isn't that appealing content or if the parental controls are too restrictive or whatever it is, kids are just going to move to a different platform that is potentially more unsafe. And so like with that in mind, keep like trying to write the policies where obviously safety is the most important thing, but where can we sacrifice and maybe like be a little bit more permissive in areas that won't sacrifice safety, to keep that appeal, to keep kids on the platform where we have these parental controls and other settings to keep them safe.
Yeah. Sounds like you have to find quite the balance, right? Quite a balance there. And you mentioned user research, Sarah. And yeah, as a child development expert and children's media professional myself, I know we're always seeking to hear children's voices and bring their voices into the decisions we're making. And you spoke about how it's important that what you're creating is appealing, and kids find what they're looking for, right? So Jenny, I'm wondering if you could share if and how Roblox incorporates children's voices into their policy decisions.
Yeah, I think we do this in a number of ways. First of all, I think companies having experts in child development is one way to kind of help elevate those voices. As Sarah mentioned, we all, in all these roles, we also work with external experts who know a lot about children, some of which I think are listening today, which I'm so grateful for. I know when we were at Roblox, we had a really, really amazing expert panel that we would actually run every single policy by to get their feedback before it was launched. And I just found that so valuable. It also helped get people on board if they didn't agree with Sarah. They'd say, let's go ask the expert panel. And we're like, okay, sure. They're going to say the same thing, but yeah, sure. Let's go do that. One thing I'm super excited about at Roblox is we just announced last year and we're about to start is we have a teen council on our civility team. And so like actually hearing, bringing stuff to these teens that we're working on and getting their feedback. So we're super excited about that. Sarah and I both having user research backgrounds, obviously these companies do user research, but I do feel that having this background in my career, I've been able to incorporate that more into policy development, not just like product development, but also to influence, like to hear from parents and kids, what do they need, what do they want, and then incorporate that into our policies. So yeah, so those are some of the ways. And like I said, all of them have been really rewarding, but I'm so excited about the Teen Council, like to actually talk to directly to teens. I think this will be really exciting.
Yeah, that's so exciting. I'll definitely be following up with you to hear more about how that's going, because that's such a wonderful, meaningful initiative. That's great. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit to talk about the future of child safety in tech. I think we all can feel the uncertainty and rapid change happening all around us these days. I'm wondering how you both see the field of trust and safety evolving in the next, let's say, 5 years or so, particularly for kids, online experiences.
Yeah, I think it's going to grow tremendously. There's so many things happening, so many regulatory concerns coming up. With Metaverse, like the platform I work on, it's not just content appropriateness, but we're also looking at conduct and contact risks because users are interacting with each other. They're different ages. And I do see a trend in general, kind of the longer we've been in this industry, the more focus these companies are having on like child safety, and keeping kids safe on the platform as users. And so I just see that becoming like company priorities across all these companies, which is really exciting and wonderful to see. Definitely, I think like we're moving towards automation when it comes to moderation. So like thinking, and Sarah might have some more comments on that being from the mod side, but just kind of thinking about how that will change trust and safety as well. So those are kind of some of the top of mind things for me.
Yeah, I think that I will say that I think that I've seen it in waves in terms of like the priorities of kids across the platform and across the industry, really. I think, several years ago, and I think it's also really driven by regulation, and it's driven by the bad things that happen on our platforms, unfortunately. I think a lot of enforcement or even solutions are often I think companies do. I mean, I know, Google, YouTube, Roblox do as much as we can proactively with the, size of the platforms that we have. Escalations will always come up. I'm sure everyone here has seen some negative press, article about both of our companies. And I think that, we know there are people inside like trying to do the right thing. Whether it's building our policies. I think, echoing Jennie, regulation is definitely a huge top of mind for a lot of people. It's been a significant part of the child safety space for a while, making sure that, CSAM and like child sexual abuse imagery is regularly caught. And I know both our platforms, do a lot of that work. But there's now a new focus on what appropriate content is and who defines that. And so I think that's where you see a lot of platforms taking the proactive approach of like, hey, we have experts in-house. We consult with people externally. We want to be the ones to make those rules and make those determinations because we believe we're the most like equipped to do so, instead of, our government, speaking from, inside the US. I think the other thing that is happening is that now I think we are in this, we're in this world where a lot of people have a lot of opinions about how kids should be safe online and even how kids should interact online. And I think there is almost the sense of like, we do have to protect kids. And of course we do, but the work we've done and the work like we've seen from other people, both from a company level, but also from an academic level is these young people have a really good understanding of how to protect themselves. They know what they do not like. They know that social media and tech is addicting, but it also has great benefits for how they engage with people, how they form connections, how they explore their identity. And I think that, like Jennie said, like the industry is really going to grow. And instead of being, I mean, we've already, kind of seeing this at Google is like, kids are not an afterthought. I think maybe for some people they may still be, but kids as design partners, both within policies, both within products, and I agree with Jennie, it's really just going to grow, and building out more centralized approaches for how we protect kids, not just like, in the bucket of like, oh, how we don't have very many kids users, do we? Like, it's a sizable amount of young people that are using these platforms. Some signed in, a lot not signed in. And so, moving more towards a world where we are protecting kids from a more holistic approach instead of just, oh, the kids team handle everything. And so I feel like it's both exciting, but then also like very daunting and like terrifying because, again, we have this small team of in-house people that are working towards this, but there's so much coming down the industry pipeline that it makes it hard to keep up with it.
I think one positive thing about all of this that we just said was that I do think it opens up the opportunity to hire more folks like us. I also see like companies who are excited to say they have people on the inside with our expertise. I know regulatory bodies often comment, oh, it's so great you have like internal experts. So that makes me hopeful that there'll be more roles like this as companies really start to see the value in hiring people with our background.
Definitely.
Great. Well, thank you both. I want to make sure we have about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we have some time for audience questions. But before we do so, I would love you to share one key takeaway that you'd like the audience to leave with, maybe in a sentence or two, if you can.
Yeah, I have a million things. I feel like a million takeaways that I've learned throughout my career. But I think the most important thing, especially if someone's interested in getting to this space, because to be honest, there isn't a clear path with someone coming with our background, is just like come from a place of yes and be open to opportunities and trying new things. Because I thought I wished I had a straight path, but it wasn't like that. But I learned so much from things I tried and I didn't like and wasn't a good fit. I learned just as much there as I did like in jobs that I was like, this is for me, this is what I want to do. And it was interesting to see when I thought for sure the role for me was user research. And then I ended up going back to policy after I got kind of my quote dream job, because it wasn't really what I wanted to do in the end. So just be open to opportunities, put yourself out there, and make genuine connections. Sorry, that's two, but that's another important one, because every job I've got has been through networking. And yeah, those things are important. And it's nice to have these relationships that continue even when you don't work together.
Yeah, I echo everything Jennie said, but I would also say, like, if you have a background in child development, or if you've worked in this space for any number of years, you are an expert and the industry needs you. I think a lot of times with people that work in the kids and family space, they're like, oh, I'm just, a lot of times it's like a natural inclination, or like, we're just very good at this. Took a long time to learn this in my career, but what we do is not, like our title says, it's not child's play. If anything, if you can work in the kids and family space at a tech company, at a smaller startup, you can do that. Your skills translate to any other team, any other product, any other area. This is, I may sound biased, but I'm actually not, but like, this is actually the most difficult work, scaling this for, kids, for their families. And it's, you are an expert. And so just, I think owning that, pushing away our imposter syndrome, which I know is very challenging.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing. I want to see if there are any audience questions. Oh, here's one coming in. What are some unexpected skills or mindsets that helped you succeed in this field?
Yeah, I can start. I think obviously research skills is not really that unexpected, but that definitely has helped both in my job as a UXR and in policy. I think one other thing is going back to what Sarah said about imposter syndrome. It is really tough, I found, to come from academia, kind of not have people believe in you that you really know how to work in the business world and tech, and really having to prove myself. And so one thing that really helped is like when you're in school and you're doing your master's or your PhD, you really become like an expert at learning. And so I think I've always just kind of tried to remember that I can learn anything, and like knowing where to go and how to learn these things. It sounds kind of basic, but you realize that not everyone actually has that skill. And so I feel like whatever job or thing I've been asked to do, like I remember, especially my first year at Google, being asked to do things that quite frankly, I didn't really know how to do them, but I would go home and research it and figure it out and fake it till I make it. And I did have the skills that I needed. So I think that was something unexpected that I've like really just has really helped my career, is just kind of reminding myself that I am capable, and that there are a lot of skills that are transferable from academia into the tech world.
Yeah, and even for those of you that aren't necessarily like, you don't have a master's or a PhD in like the child development space, a lot of project program management skills like really apply very well. Being able to, build a project plan, being able to execute it. I think the execution side of things is incredibly challenging. I think sometimes, especially working in tech, there's this, this glory of like, I want to be the one to solve the problem, but there's a lot of people that talk about what we want to do. And I have found a niche for myself in like, that's great. Not that I don't like to be recognized, but like really thrive on like being in the background, like making things work and making things happen. I've seen the transition with, former teachers or people that worked in, admin or marketing. So if you're someone that's super passionate about this space and has been in this space, not necessarily in a researcher capacity, but like understanding like the process from moving from like A to B to C, like all the way down the project like life cycle, those people are like, I think a lot of times don't get the glory that they deserve, because it's really hard, making policies like Jennie creates, like usable and workable and approvable by our like core stakeholders that a lot of times don't understand what our job is.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing. Any other questions coming in? Let's see.
I see there's one around what strategies does Roblox. Oh, sorry. It looks like another one popped up here.
Ooh, okay. Yeah. If you had a blank check to hire and had unlimited resources to make anything happen in your field, what would you do?
Well, I would hire a team of people with our background, because I feel like there's so much work to do, and I would love to have a team. That's one thing I really enjoyed about working in UX on the Google Kids and Family team, was I was surrounded by people who were as passionate about kids and geeked out on child development stuff as I did. So I would like that. And also, I think if I had unlimited resources, put a lot of that into moderation, just because it's so difficult and so expensive, but it's so important. And so I think those are the two things that I would do.
Yeah, I echo Jennie in that moderation, content moderators, it's very expensive to maintain it. It's really challenging to, build a really robust training plan. A lot of times it's, kind of people that work in the space. I think Jennie and I built training plans for our content moderators, and we're not like learning designers. I do work with a brilliant learning designer who has just completely retransformated our work. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot. Yeah, I mean, if I had unlimited resources, and like I think yes, like hiring or restructuring, like to have like a truly like kids and family centralized focused team instead of just an offshoot. A lot of times it's an offshoot. It's like, oh, here you can have 3 people to support this work. That's all you need, right? And then you get more users, and then you have escalations, and it's not feasible. So I know there is a push away from like using content moderation, especially with the Gen AI focus right now. I don't think we're like close to moving away from humans. And I like am a huge proponent that we always need humans to be doing this. So a really robust content moderation team is my vote too.
Yeah, I think while you're talking, another thing that comes up to mind is I really loved working with that external expert panel at YouTube. So I think having the money because it's always important to pay academics for their time. They're always expected to do it for free, but to have really like an amazing expert panel would also be something I would do if I had unlimited budget.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I can't believe our time together has come to a close. I want to thank both Dr. Jennie Ito and Sarah Sweney for teaching us so much about one of the most critical topics in our industry. And I learned so much in just a short hour. I could talk to you both for much longer. It certainly is not child's play. So thank you both so much for doing such critical work and taking the time to teach us about it today. To everyone watching, we hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for coming. A recording of this presentation will be available just after we sign off in our screening room and in our LinkedIn or on our LinkedIn group page. Please do like and share with others you think may be interested. So on behalf of the Children's Media Association, thanks again for being a part of today's discussion. There are so many great things happening in this industry and in CMA, and we're grateful to help drive innovation and connection. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.